Good morning. I'm trying to wake up here, so I'm a little slow. Just don't worry about it too much. Sorry, tired. Believe it or not, during this quarantine, I actually get less sleep. I'm not sure how that's possible. But I wanted to introduce part two of the civil rights movement to you. And for this part, we're going to refer to it as nonviolent direct action. That's what we call this part of it. And it really started with the tail end of the last part. And I wanted to talk about those things a little bit before we move forward um, with Martin Luther King coming on the scene in what's called the Montgomery bus boycott. Two of the terms you had last time were the Montgomery bus boycott and Little Rock Nine. And these are really two early versions of this nonviolent direct action, um, or at least the bus boycott is. And what it is, and we're going to read about it later on in this part, is Martin Luther King's beliefs in nonviolence and to confront what he calls unjust laws. And we really don't see this articulated or spoken or talked about until a little bit later, and I'll share that with you. But what he's trying to do is draw attention to the problem. And if you purposely take action and later on, break laws, but he calls them unjust laws. Okay, the boycott is not illegal. Where some of their other activities they do in this time period, this nonviolent direct action or civil disobedience, it's often referred to as well, is directly challenging these laws by, let's say, going to a restaurant and sitting in a place you're not legally allowed to sit as an African American. It's called a sit-in. Okay, challenging the law, pointing out the problem, causing a concern for the entire community. That's his plan. To create tension, he says, to foster a crisis, right? So that the community can't ignore the problem anymore and they have to deal with it. And early on, we see some of these pushes. It's not illegal, but it's causing that problem for the community in the Montgomery bus boycott. You should have had that term done, but most of you are familiar, at least with Rosa Parks. She's arrested for refusing to give her seat to a white man on a bus. Buses were segregated, as was everything else. So some people believe she was in the white section, sat in the white section of the bus. She did not. She was in the first seat of the black section, designated for African Americans, okay? When the white section was full, the rule was a white passenger could demand a black passenger get up and take their seat. Well, she was asked to get up and she said no. Now, this wasn't a spontaneous, we're all of a sudden going to do this. She had been working with the NAACP to do this, and she then becomes a test case, I guess you'd say. You can't challenge laws in court without there being an incident. The Supreme Court's not going to see it if there wasn't like a reason for it. So when she's arrested, they begin appealing and challenging in courts, and it makes it to the Supreme Court. Oh, well, this one doesn't actually go all the way to the Supreme Court. I'm sorry. But it does go through several trials and appeals and draws all sorts of attention. But what they do to really make the case known is this bus boycott. 2/3 of the passengers in Montgomery at that time were African Americans on the public transport. When all of a sudden 2/3 of your riders aren't on the bus company starts to notice. And the bus company starts to put pressure on the city to solve it so they can start making their money again. And over the course of almost a year, this boycott goes on where African Americans found different ways to ride to work or to walk or whatever they had to do to avoid the buses. And the leader of this, who becomes a national figure, is Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old when it started. And already kind of this guy that stands out is like, wow, he really knows what he's doing. And that sort of starts the ball rolling. In Little Rock, totally different case, but it was 9 students chosen to integrate the public schools. Brown versus the board decision says schools can't be segregated anymore. So the process of integrating is very difficult, especially when southern states and cities are saying, nope, not doing it. The movement has to come along as a way to force that stuff to happen. That's why we have a civil rights movement, is it has to force the issue. Okay. And Little Rock, these 9 students are refused. It takes the president eventually and the 101st Airborne to come in and secure the school to allow the students to come in. This is crazy stuff. You think, well, how was it such a big deal? To the Southerners, it was. White Southerners were resistant. So the movement is really about forcing that change. Laws had changed on the books. People were not changing. States were not changing. So the movement comes along to force it to happen. And the way it works, the force that creates the change is civil disobedience, or what Martin Luther King calls nonviolent direct action. And that's part 2. That's what we're getting into. Okay, so follow along. Well, the assignment you're going to have looks like this. Part 2 of the study guide. And it tells you what the main points are that we're going to cover. Describe the methods used by the nonviolent movement. Whoops. The computer's a little slow, so when I move, it doesn't move. It went too far. Describe the methods used by the nonviolent movement and the ideas behind civil disobedience. List some of the changes made at the state and federal levels as a result of the civil rights movement. So we'll talk about those 2 things, mainly the first bullet. And you have some terms. These also will be found on the presentations, the notes. There's going to be a Quizlet list as well again, so you should be able to find these pretty easily, but they're all there somewhere. Okay? Then we get into some of the questions. A little bit different than last time, mostly writing. I know your favorite, right? You're like, yes, I've been wanting to write more. You're in luck. This goes with quite a few videos as well. There's some notes on it, but there's also videos on Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and sit-ins. Okay, it says watch the 2 videos, describe the methods used by SNCC, as they're called, and how sit-ins worked, and how white Southerners reacted to the sit-ins. Okay, watch the videos, and it will tell you. Freedom Rides. After watching the video on Freedom Riders, explain the point of the Freedom Rides, detail the dangers faced by the riders, and explain the impact they had on federal laws. You'll have to do that, but the video is, again, pretty straightforward. I will, I thought I had that attached here. I will attach a link on here, but they'll also be on Classroom. And they're all short videos. They all pretty much straightforwardly tell you what happened. Watch them. Okay. The last part is about Martin Luther King's philosophy. And this is where we really learn about what he was all about. In 1963, while conducting a campaign of civil disobedience in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. Led a march in defiance of a court order and was arrested. While in jail, he wrote a letter to local religious leaders who had criticized the movement's actions. He was responding to, there were several local clergy, as they're called, who were saying that his demonstrations were ill-timed, that the city was trying to change, but he came in and started causing trouble. Okay? So he writes a letter back to them while in jail, and it's called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Not the most exciting title, but it describes exactly where it was. And he explains his philosophy. So there are excerpts from that letter. It's a long letter. I'm giving you a few pages to take a look at and answer these questions about why does he do direct action, why sit-ins, marches, and so forth. Okay, and there's 4 questions about it. Oh, I'm sorry, there's 3 questions about it, and then one on Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. The most well-known portion of that speech, because it's, I think, a 19-minute speech. The most well-known is the last 5 minutes. It should sound familiar. Most of you have probably heard a clip of it by now. If not, enjoy. It's a great speech. And I just want you to watch that clip and then answer this question. So there's a few, some reading. There's some videos to watch. They're all pretty short, but they are important. So make sure you watch them. Okay, so that's the assignment. The notes kind of look something like this. So it's going to take you through what I just talked about. The 2 big ideas. All right. Oh, I did leave Rosa Parks on here. Well, who knew? Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott. It just talks about what happened and where Martin Luther King comes on the scene. There he is just a 26-year-old guy, barely older than you guys. Okay. And then this just goes into what nonviolent direct action is. So the notes contain quite a bit of information. Sit-ins, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, etc. And one thing you'll learn hopefully when you watch the sit-ins, you'll see them going into these places that look like this. It's called a lunch counter. A lot of department stores around the country, before we had big box stores like Walmart and Target and Kmart even, we had department stores that had the same things just on a much smaller scale. And one of the things they often had was a lunch counter like this, right? You can go in and you can have sandwiches or some meals of some sort, whatever. In the South, they were segregated. Now, either there was a section for African Americans designated to sit, or they weren't allowed to sit there at all, but they could order food and take it out. Couldn't sit there. So the sit-in movement involves these lunch counters, right? The first one taking place in February of 1960. Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students right here decide to spontaneously do a sit-in at a lunch counter. And that goes on for a while, and people start to hear about it, and sit-ins then are started in other places all over the South. Okay, so the video will describe that in some detail about SNCC, then the sit-ins tell you sort of their tactics and what they encountered, and often encountered, as the movement went on, violent reactions. But they were dedicated to being nonviolent. They were trained to be nonviolent. That's one of the things that SNCC does, is it trains their members to be nonviolent. And so they didn't fight back. I know that sounds like, wait, wouldn't your first reaction? I'm going to start punching back. But they knew if they did, the public wouldn't support the movement. So they had to remain nonviolent. They wanted the public to support them. They didn't want them to be looked at as the causer, causing all the trouble. They wanted it to be clear that the white demonstrators, like these guys that show up at sit-ins, to be the bad guy. These guys are the good guy. Now, to a lot of white Southerners, these would never be the bad guys. These would never be the good guys. But to most of the country, a lot of the Northerners, a lot of moderates, people living in the South that didn't support segregation, good guys, bad guys. All right? That's the point of being nonviolent. You can't win support of the masses by being violent. Then the next phase is the freedom rides, taken on by a couple different organizations attempting to test the segregation or desegregation rules of the South for interstate transport. And that's you'll hear about that. And then it shows their route, on the notes, some of the things that happened, some of the violence against them, including a bombing of one of their buses. Talks about that, how they were beaten in Birmingham. And then it goes on to Project C. But the notes go on to Project C so you can get the information about it. I don't spend, because normally in class I would spend a lot of time on Project C because it's very important. Right now, what I just want you to get is the methods of demonstration, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the marches. And from Project C, I want you to learn about Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And that's what you're going to have to read about. It talks about what Project C was and when he was arrested, and then the reactions of some of the whites, including the police commissioner, Bull Connor in Birmingham, who attacked the demonstrators with dogs and fire hoses. Okay. Then it goes on to the March on Washington. Pretty horrible stuff, by the way. Goes on to, Letter from Birmingham Jail, then the March on Washington. Okay. So that's this segment. I just wanted to do this preview. I know it's kind of a lengthy preview. Sorry. But it covers a lot of information and stuff that's important to understand. So make sure you get it done. I'll have it again due by next Wednesday, so that Thursday, Friday, we start new stuff. And we'll wrap up the unit on the next week, talking about some of the conflict and turmoil and changes that came because of frustration. And then the assassination of Martin Luther King. So this part of the unit is just about trying to understand the nonviolent direct action that was taken. How do they draw attention to the problem, create tension for the cities, and force them to deal with the issues? Force the white Southern authority to deal with segregation and say, okay, we realize that if we continue this, it's going to be not normal. We're going to have a rough time in our city, and we're going to lose money. Businesses were losing money, so the businesses got involved and said, stop it. We want customers. And that's really where things begin to break down, through this action. It was not going to happen on its own, even if the court said do it. It wasn't happening. So the civil rights movement is really all about forcing that change, and that's what this part's about. Very important. So make sure you watch the videos, make sure you do the assignment, read the material, and there you go. So have a good rest of your day. Enjoy the material provided, because it's actually pretty good. I know you're thinking it's history. How could it be great? It's always great, by the way. But this is good stuff. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is one of the greatest speeches in history. And you'll watch the part that everyone seems to know is the I Have a Dream part. And it's fantastic. But the rest of this stuff about sit-ins, freedom rides, it's good information. One of the things that drew me to wanting to teach is I didn't learn necessarily about this stuff. Didn't realize how serious it was. And when I did finally learn about it, I felt like, you know what? I want other people to see this. I want other people to know that this is how bad it was. This is what happened. This is how crazy things got. So watch the videos, do the assignment. Talk to you soon. Have a good one.